Traveling is an incredible experience, but safety should always be a top priority. In this video, we'll delve into the countries where Americans and Westerners might encounter some challenges while exploring. So let's check out 10 most dangerous countries for Americans or Westerners. Number 10. Yemen. Our first country on the list is Yemen. Political turmoil and civil unrest have led to a very unstable environment here. The ongoing conflict has resulted in a dire humanitarian crisis, making it an extremely risky destination for Westerners. In 2016, a U.S. Navy destroyer sailing through the Red Sea was targeted by 2 missiles launched from Yemen. The U.S. Mason repelled the attack, but the saga marked the beginning of increased tensions between the U.S. and Yemen. In July of 2018, the State Department officially placed Yemen on its Do Not Travel list, citing health issues, civil unrest, and armed conflict. According to the United Nations, Yemen is currently immersed in the world's worst humanitarian crisis. More than 5 years of ongoing military conflict has forced 4.3 million people to leave their homes and put 14 million people at risk of starvation and deadly disease. About 80% of the Yemen population, 24 million people, is in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. Number 9. Afghanistan. Next up, Afghanistan. While efforts have been made to stabilize the country, it's still considered a high-risk area due to the presence of various militant groups and the potential for violent incidents. The U.S. has been embroiled in an international conflict in Afghanistan since 2001. It should come as no surprise that the nation makes the cut for the State Department's Do Not Travel list. Dangers include kidnappings, hostage-taking, suicide bombings, widespread military combat operations, landmines, and insurgent attacks. Transportation hubs, tourist locations, government buildings, and public spaces are all potential targets, with a 2022 score of 3.554, actually slightly safer than 2021's 3.631. Afghanistan remains the most dangerous country in the world for the 5th year in a row. A war-torn country that has been mired in war, revolution, and civil strife for decades, Afghanistan has a higher number of deaths from war and terrorism than any other country in the world. A considerable achievement considering Russia and Ukraine were actually at war for several months while the data was being collected. Number 8. Libya. Moving on to Libya, the aftermath of the Arab Spring and the subsequent power struggles have left the country in a state of chaos. Kidnappings and armed clashes are not uncommon here, making it a perilous place for Western travelers. Libya has experienced significant instability since the overthrow of its former government. The level of crimes committed in the country increases daily, including kidnap threats for ransom. As an American, you should know the target of these crimes are usually Westerners and U.S. citizens. So take caution if you ever want to try visiting this place. In fact, the U.S. Department advises against visiting. Nowadays, Libya is beset by political upheaval and is divided into opposing governments, evoking a tense situation with a high probability of violent crime, forcible detention, and insurgency. The perpetual security issues in the country date back to 2011, when the Arab Spring protests took place, inducing bringing down Muammar Gaddafi and a lack of leadership that various militias took advantage of. These military factions have been engaging in armed clashes, forcing millions to flee and placing the state among the most dangerous countries in the world for travel. Number 7. Syria. Syria has been ravaged by a brutal civil war for years. With ongoing violence, bombings, and the presence of extremist groups, it's strongly advised for Westerners to avoid this country altogether. Once a jewel of the Middle East, Syria's historic capital of Damascus has been reduced to a shadow of its former self after 8 years of civil war, entangling nearly every military power in the region, including the U.S., Russia, Turkey, and Iran. The State Department currently advises American citizens not to travel to the country due to terrorism, civil unrest, and armed conflict. The Syrian civil war has plagued the country since March 2011 and has been the second deadliest war of the 21st century. As of March 2019, 5.7 million people had fled Syria, and more than 6 million had been displaced internally. Syria's 2022 GPI of 3.356 can be attributed to ongoing conflict, civil unrest, and widespread violent crime, including robberies, assaults, carjacking, and kidnappings. Armed conflict exists mostly between the government and opposition groups, with little to no rule of law or order in place outside the country's capital of Juba. Number 6. Venezuela. Shifting our focus to South America, Venezuela is facing economic and political instability. High crime rates, including kidnappings and street violence, make it a dangerous destination for Western travelers. Venezuela was placed on the Do Not Travel list on January 29, 2019. The most recent addition to the list cites crime, civil unrest, arbitrary arrest, and poor health infrastructure as risks to American travelers. A standoff between the country's military and a new self-declared interim leader has taken tension in the South American country to a fever pitch. Number 5. Somalia. Now let's discuss Somalia. This African nation has struggled with piracy, terrorism, and political instability for years. The presence of militant groups and the lack of a stable government pose significant risks to travelers. In June of 2018, a Canadian judge sentenced a Somali national to 15 years in prison following conviction for the kidnapping of 27-year-old Canadian freelance journalist Amanda Lindhout. Lindhout was on a 4-week tour of Africa with an Australian co-worker in 2008 when the two were pulled from their vehicle by a group of armed men. 11 years later, the U.S. government maintains advisories against travel to Somalia, where kidnapping and piracy are still rampant. Number 4. Central African Republic. The Central African Republic is another country to be cautious about. Rampant crime, civil unrest, and a lack of basic infrastructure contribute to its challenging environment for Westerners. The Central African Republic is an underdeveloped and unstable country where ongoing armed conflict between the government and rebel forces, high levels of violent crime, and a deeply substandard healthcare system pose serious risks for travelers. Violence between rebel groups and the Wagner Group-backed government has increased since 2020. The country's borders with Cameroon, Chad, and the Democratic Republic of Congo are largely under the control of various violent non-state actors and experience severe violent crime and frequent armed clashes. The medical system in Central African Republic falls far below international standards of care. Travel should only be undertaken with a full but low-profile security detail, following careful route assessments and reconnaissance. Number 3. Iraq. Iraq's recent history of conflict and the presence of extremist groups still pose threats to travelers. While there have been improvements in some areas, it's essential to be aware of the ongoing risks. Think twice before traveling to this cradle of civilization. American civilians traveling to Iraq risk kidnapping, injury, and death in addition to arrests, fines, and expulsion. According to the most recent report from the State Department, insurgent groups within the country still regularly attack both Iraqi security forces and citizens. Iraq continues to have both internal and external conflicts, including likely terrorist attacks. ISIS continues to capture and kill both civilians and members of the Iraqi armed forces. Other human rights violations, including violations of freedom of assembly and women's rights, have also persisted. U.S. citizens visiting Iraq are at particularly high risk for violence and kidnapping, being sought-after targets among anti-U.S. sectarian militias throughout Iraq. Number 2. North Korea. And now, let's talk about North Korea. This isolated nation is known for its strict regulations and lack of transparency. Visiting as a Westerner is heavily controlled, and any misstep could lead to serious consequences. Tensions flared between the U.S. and North Korea in 2016, when an American tourist was arrested and detained for over a year after reportedly attempting to steal a propaganda poster from a Pyongyang hotel. Otto Warmbier, 22, was eventually released back to the U.S. in a vegetative state and subsequently died from injuries sustained during his imprisonment. Number 1. Democratic Republic of Congo. Our final country is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Instability, armed conflict, and health risks, including outbreaks of diseases like Ebola, make it a challenging destination for Americans and Westerners, ranking in the top 3, along with Russia and Iraq, in the category of deaths from external conflict. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is also the second most dangerous country in sub-Saharan Africa. Poverty and political unrest are an everyday occurrence, with rebels and armed forces wandering certain areas at will. Crimes including murder, rape, kidnapping, carjackings, burglaries, muggings, and highway robberies are fairly common. Even natural disasters such as floods, earthquakes, and even volcanic eruptions are a concern. Please subscribe to Travel the World. Thank you for watching.